Does Toby Fox misunderstand composition rights? We're going to explore that question today from a few different angles by looking at a clip on YouTube from the streamer Alpharad, who explains an experience he had with Toby Fox where there was a song from Undertale that he wanted to license for his videos, and the response that he got from Mr. Fox was curious. There's a lot going on in it that we're going to break down today. In this video, we are first going to establish the difference between composition rights versus the recording rights. After that, we are going to hear streamer Alpharad relay a story he had about an exchange with Toby regarding composition and master recording rights of an Undertale song, which will establish a fair few concerns of sweeping statements that don't really match with precedent and the contents of the game and its music. And finally, with those details established, I will be issuing Toby his sentencing, which will specify what Toby needs to do in order to atone for this situation. And so the one criteria that I'm going to establish before we look at this Alpharad clip is that when it comes to music rights, there are two separate components of the rights. There's the rights to the composition itself, but then also the master recording rights. So if the composition is the song you wrote, the notes on the page, the instructions for the musician, I don't know that they have to literally write it on paper and submit it to an ultimate database for registration, but the understanding that the composition contained in the music, which can be quantified in sheet music and such, is itself the intellectual property. Then the recording rights are, we take this composition and then we go into the recording studio and record the version of the song that's going to be on the album and play on the radio and all that. So many of you may have seen the headlines in the past few years about Taylor Swift, whose experience with composition rights versus master recording rights has led to a wild new emergent scenario of how these contracts work. So Taylor Swift rose to fame, she wrote her song, she signed the record deal, recorded a bunch of albums. Okay, mainstream sensation. But after a lot of time goes by, she has a falling out with her label. So now there's bad blood with the label. And this label is taking a sizable share of the revenue share due to owning the recording rights. So while Taylor Swift herself retains the composition rights in perpetuity, her record label is actually the party that maintains the rights to the master recording, right? The specific recording that Taylor recorded in the studio to go on the album and the radio and Spotify and whatnot. So once this fallout got more severe, Miss Swift arrived at what she determined was a solution to the problem. She realized, due to some nudging by Kelly Clarkson, that while Taylor Swift owns the composition rights and the record label owns the recordings, well, there's actually no stipulation about Taylor Swift taking her composition and making a new recording. Now, that could be something like a remix. If Taylor Swift were to take her composition, record a new version of it as a remix, she is allowed to do that, no problem. You may be surprised to learn that she is also completely at liberty, per the conditions of her contract, to take her composition, re-record a new version of the song that sounds like just about the same as the original, but because it is technically and literally a new recording, Taylor can own that recording for herself. She can put it on Spotify, have it play, and she gets all the revenue for that, not having to share it with the record label. And so that's why when you look up Taylor Swift songs on Spotify, you may or may not notice the parentheses qualifier that says Bad Blood, Taylor's version, Shake It Off, Taylor's version, for example. Okay, so now that we've established the principal difference between composition versus recording rights, let's now listen to Alpharad's clip where he's going to explain the response that he got from Mr. Fox when he reached out to ask for some kind of licensing so that he would be able to use an Undertale song in his content.
I reached out to him because, I use Dating Start in all of my sponsored videos and whatnot. So I reached out to Toby Fox and I said, hey, a lot of the sponsors, or I use Dating Start in every single sponsor. And now a lot of the sponsors are getting wise that I don't own the rights to the song. So I know that you don't normally do this, but can I buy a license for Dating Start so I can use it in all of the sponsored segments? And then he just said sorry, we don't normally do stuff like that, But I will say, the compositions are online, and everything I use to make the songs are just public domain. You can find them anywhere. So if you were to go recreate the song one-to-one and make it sound the exact same, then you can just tell NordVPN that you made it yourself. So Toby Fox just told me to lie to all these major corporations and say that I made the song. And you know what? That's what I've been doing since.
Okay, so Alpharad had been using this Undertale song, and so literally the sponsors themselves expressed a concern. They're like, hey, do you own this song? Are you at liberty to use it in your sponsored ad reads? You know, because that could cause a problem down the line. Are these ads going to have to get taken down and take down a video that has what was supposed to be, you know, a permanent element of this or that video? Okay, so the first part of that is to say the songs are online. The compositions are online. So what does that mean that a composition is online? It's a pretty simple thing to say. Don't Stop Believin' by Journey is online in the sense that if you type in Journey Don't Stop Believin' into YouTube, it's going to come up. Now, what could it otherwise or actually mean to say the compositions are online? Like, if anything, I would think that a composition being freely available online, for that to mean anything substantive, it would have to be some kind of Creative Commons share-alike license, or that it was declared as being in the public domain. One of those official things that makes it crystal clear, yes, this is in the public domain, you have the ability and rights to take this and implement it into your content. Okay, so right away we have a problem, because if you were to go talk to Toby's record label, where they're going to state outright that Toby is the composer and that Toby owns the composition, and for that matter, there's no composer credits in the original game of Undertale and in the primary versions of the soundtrack that were officially published through his record label on CD and vinyl. So you notice the issue here is that it would have been one thing if Toby said, I own the composition and I hereby give you the rights. But that's not what he said. He basically said, oh no, it's available. You're free to use that. That's above board. So that was the data point that Toby gave specifically for the composition rights, if we're talking about that Taylor Swift example of composition versus recording. So now what Alpharad will say next pertains specifically to the recording, which in this day and age, you know, you say recording, it's more technically a render because you're using sound fonts, and then when you're done with the project, you click in the drop-down, export file. But we're just going to call it a recording for the sake of this discussion.
And he just said, like, everything I use to make the songs are just public domain. You can find them anywhere.
So everything used to make the songs are just public domain. Do tell, pray tell, where is Toby Fox getting this? We're not going to go into a deep dive of all the audio tidbits that appear in Undertale that have raised some eyebrows of like, is that actually from source X, and is it okay for this to be here? Royal Sciences LLC has never uttered a peep on this one way or the other, but you buy the game and hear the sounds and you're like, huh? What is this doing here? And so here in a quick sweeping statement, Toby just flat out says all the sounds that appear in the game are public domain, and it just feels like those are words floating in the air with no basis in anything as to where these resources are available. For that to make sense, we would need to know where these sound fonts are hosted and what license gives the impression that it's public domain. It's bizarre to hear Toby Fox use the word public domain in a situation like this, because Toby seems to have an incomplete understanding of public domain itself, given the examples such like the excerpt of Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen that appears as dialogue uncredited and uncited in Undertale the game. So basically what Toby is telling Alpharad here is to, oh, okay, well, if the composition rights are fine, as far as the recording, don't actually use the direct rip of the game from Undertale, but just get all the sound fonts and recreate it yourself. That way you own that recording, and since the composition is freely available online, says Toby, whatever that means, you're good to go. So this is a very vague directive that is concerning, because these are the kinds of careless sweeping statements that Toby has made in the past past wwithout the necessary important precision that have led to stressful disasters like the Undertale Yellow situation. Some well-meaning fan game developers emailed Toby and asked if they could make a fan game, and he just kind of gave this vague, cryptic response that seemed to give a thumb up and say, "Do what thou wilt." So because he wanted to approach that conversation like sort of as a mysterious character with not really a lot of specifics, that led to a great deal of stress and conflict, and Toby rolling up way after the fact to slap a $20,000 band-aid on the problem and call it a day. Now, we should qualify all of this that this is a second-hand account from Alpharad, so technically the exact wording might not be exactly as is reported by him here. So let's just make that caveat clear that everything we're talking about today in this video is technically a what-if. We are discussing the implications. What if everything Alpharad is saying about Toby's statement is perfectly true? What are the implications of that? And does that reading of events conflict with things that we see in Undertale or its surrounding properties? So, with stressful, unnecessary, unforced error situations like Undertale Yellow, this sweeping statement that Toby allegedly made to Alpharad poses some serious concerns. There's a whole generation of composers and game developers that look up to Toby for cues, and since there's so little publicly available documentation of Toby the person behind the game and how he went about creating it following all the proper expectations of crediting and rights, well, this poses a problem, and we don't want the upcoming impressionable generation to draw the wrong conclusions from this and land themselves in an unnecessary pickle the way the Undertale Yellow fans did. So, Toby Fox, I sentence you to clarifying your stance and approach to the composing rights and/or master recording rights, because there's way too much sweeping, vague elements to this direction you've provided, Alpharad, and this is not instilling any additional confidence in the veracity of all the music in Undertale 15 being as it should be, following all the basic expectations and the social contract of releasing original music. Now, the lack of crediting of music compositions in Undertale 2015 was a component under review when I did my investigation video as to whether Spear of Justice from Undertale 15 is an original composition or not. Now, this aspect of Toby's potentially warped perception of how composing and recording rights work at first seemed to maybe possibly have a connection to the bizarrely odd copyright content ID situation on YouTube. It gave the impression of, oh, okay, if there's a sort of vague public domain, not really clear about who owns the composition rights, as further reinforced by what Alpharad has said, could that also be partly because some of the melodies contained within Undertale 15 are not Toby's own, and so the content ID system is freaking out over Undertale music in a way that it does not with a lot of other games. And this was just a possibility that I considered early on, because Undertale was not the only game soundtrack that this was happening to. I mean, you ask any gamer in the community, especially those that are involved in content creation, if you ask them what game soundtracks come to mind in terms of constantly getting content IDs where the algorithm is picking a fight, claiming that your music is licensed and you don't have the rights to it, even though you're just streaming a video game with its music. Well, another property that is infamous for having lots and lots of content ID struggles is, of course, Mario. Super Mario games are legendarily known for constantly getting flagged by the system, and that may be partly because of Nintendo's ways. So as I think of other games that are notorious for getting their music content ID'd and flagged, I found it bizarrely salient that Mario games would be a hotbed for this very specific issue, since, upon looking into it, Mario music was also found to contain composition elements that were not what they seemed at first listen. That seemed that they contained way too much of a composition by someone else, whether it's the fairy fountain music, music in Zelda, or the entire main melody motif of Super Mario World being taken and adapted directly from the song Green Green by the New Christy Minstrels, which was an American folk group active in the United States in the 60s and 70s. Okay, now I compare that to my beloved Blue Hedgehog Sonic and his series of games, and believe me, I'm grateful as a starting point for the fact that copyright content ID stuff in Sonic music is something I have basically never had to deal with. However, I have heard from others in the Sonic community that the one game that keeps coming up, if it's going to come up to have hiccups with the content ID, is Sonic 1, the original game that came out in 1991, composed by Masato Nakamura, who, it was discovered upon review, included elements in his music that were not necessarily his to use. You got Planet Earth by Duran Duran, Music to Watch Girls by, written by Bob Crew. And so I'm sitting there in my, hypothesis laboratory, wondering, is there a connection between music that presents itself as original but maybe isn't, and that tripping up something with the content ID system? Further complicated in the situation of Undertale by the fact that Toby asserted to Alpharad that the composition was in some form freely available or in the public domain, or which one is it? So at the end of my review, I concluded that the copyright content ID issue was most likely a red herring. I would say that I still regard it as like a 2-3% possibility, but I've all but discounted it and am not looking into that any further. It is bizarre to find those shared sets of criteria between the three, but it's not like there aren't other games that experience these kinds of things. So that's the last food for thought that I'm going to leave you with watching this video, and thank you for listening, is that if the copyright situation with Undertale and content ID headaches, if those problems are still happening, if I personally was directly impacted by that, well, the first thing I would want to know is what is exactly technically, on a literal technical basis, what is responsible for triggering these content IDs? I'm ready to all but discount and write off the possibility that it involves a red pan situation tripping up Bob Crew or Duran Duran's composition in the algorithm, but I think it's fair enough to want to know, is the reason it's getting triggered by the content ID because of the composition, right? Because the content ID system can analyze audio and detect the melody even if it's not a complete match with the original pure master recording, okay? Or is the reason it's getting picked up in the system because it is literally the exact audio recording that is a direct match? I wondered for a moment, since Undertale's record label had provided conflicting information at different points in time, I hypothesized that maybe the reason it's getting triggered in the system as a content ID is not because Undertale is placing a claim, but rather Skyfire or Paul McCartney or any number of potential sources that could ultimately stem from Toby's vague and concerning sweeping understanding of his compositions just being freely available or in some form of public domain. So in closing, I will say that when I asked around specifically about Undertale's content ID situation, I was first given indication that the way Undertale's content ID system works is fully as intended, and that the automatic content ID matches that occur are part of intended business as usual, that those claims getting triggered automatically is, as has been stated, they are within their rights to have those content ID matches trigger. But then when I spoke with a prominent member of the Undertale community, I was given different information that conflicted with that, which was that, oh no, the way that Undertale suffers from this thing is just like so many other games where people abuse the system, and every video game community has these bad agents that abuse the system. There's nothing odd or unusual about Undertale, and it's like, whoa, okay, that doesn't add up because that is totally in conflict with a representative from Undertale's record label saying, yes, these third-party music services are within their rights to file these content ID claims. So this prominent Undertale community figure who I spoke to basically begged me to just drop it, right? I expressed my concerns. They were all downplayed with said conflicting information, and this person begged me to stop talking about it publicly. And you know what? Technically, I honored that. So because I accepted that begging appeal, what's going to happen right now is that I am going to withhold those follow-up questions that I have. Questions that I have, the answers to which may shed light on any lingering confusion and conflicting information surrounding this situation. Questions that may ultimately shed light on why the current system is set up the way it is. Specifically, when this or that video gets triggered for a content ID, what impact does that have on which dollars go where? Is that overall catch-all designed intentionally exactly the way it is? Unfortunately, you will never hear me ask those questions because the video is over now, so have a good afternoon.